Some news organizations outside Indonesia were instruments for broadcasting Western propaganda into Indonesia.
Of course, Radio Australia worked closely with the Foreign Affairs Department in Canberra and got advice or guidance, let's put it that way, got guidance from the department as to what it should say in its broadcasts. From time to time that guidance wasn't followed, but mostly it's true to say it was followed.
The BBC's reputation amongst listeners in Indonesia was high, and at a time when the Indonesian people would feel that they could not rely on their own media, they of course are going to be leaning on what they regard as reliable sources, BBC, Radio Australia and so forth. I think there's no question whatsoever that we were all manipulated. I think probably the manipulation was being orchestrated by Norman Redaway, but I've no doubt that he too was also a part of an organisation in which the Indonesians played their part, the Americans certainly played their part.
Six months after the murder of the generals, hundreds of thousands of communists and their alleged supporters lay dead. General Suharto's troops surround Sukarno's palace, causing him to flee by helicopter. Later that day, President Sukarno is forced to sign a letter which hands the power of the presidency to General Suharto. Soeharto immediately uses the letter to arrest 13 members of President Sukarno's cabinet and to legitimize the slaughter of suspected communists.
Jelas dan kita semua tahu bahwa kekacauan dan ketegangan sekarang ini disebabkan karena PKI. Saya menggunakan surat perintah ini untuk membubarkan Partai Komunis Indonesia.
Dikiranya SP 11 Maret itu satu transfer of sovereignty, of authority. Padahal tidak.
Despite President Sukarno's objections, General Suharto had effectively wrested control of the Indonesian state. His takeover was reported as a gentlemanly affair in the London Observer and welcomed in the New York Times, which hailed Suharto as a gleam of light in Asia.
I welcomed the Suharto regime, and most of the journalists did. It was the first time order had been seen in Indonesia for about 10 years. The Economist in early to mid-1966 started peddling the US line that Indonesia was safer under a disciplined rule. That certainly was true, it was safer, but to deny the level of destruction and the human tragedy that had taken place seemed to me quite idiotic.
The majority, I think, of the press was looking the other way. You know, there was no condemnation of it, I think. It was kind of tolerated and accepted. In fact, a kind of welcoming that Indonesia was joining the fold of the anti-communist movement.
The Indonesian domino ultimately fell on the western side of the Cold War divide. Compared with getting bogged down in Vietnam, it was seen as a clear victory for anti-communism and for President Lyndon Johnson. Visiting Vietnam later in 1966, LBJ was to invoke Indonesia as a rallying point. He told US troops that their exploits were the reason why people in Indonesia were enjoying freedom that they didn't previously have. But in reality, it would be more than 3 decades before Indonesia would taste political freedom and freedom of speech. Now, after General Suharto has fallen, Indonesians can finally question his official version of their history. Like Professor Arif Budianto, the forensic pathologist who in 1965 was called to examine the bodies of the dead generals.
I got 3 bodies to examine. Not a single one of the bodies do we find the penis slice or we had signs of torturing, yeah, we don't find. Nobody is glad to sign our reports because the newspapers, they wrote already about the torturing. They said the penis too, they cut it off and then they throw it. They play with that, the Garwani's women.
Professor Budianto's autopsy report was suppressed under the orders of General Soeharto. Many Western journalists accepted the lurid story without question.
Terror and bestiality was a calculated part of the PKI plan. They even had special mutilation squads made up of girls. Sex orgies went on before the torture ceremonies got underway. Eventually, the mutilated bodies were dumped down a well.
This monument was built at the place where the generals' bodies were dumped down the well.
This is what pains me most, to see the women here, because I spent several years together with women who had been tortured to confess that they had perpetrated sexual crimes against the bodies of these generals. And of course we know that that was not true. Their confessions were published in the newspapers. And this was perhaps the most important propaganda weapon that Soeharto used to send people out and kill members of, or suspects, communist suspects, family, everything. Ini dia umur berapa? 10. 10 juga? Sekecil. Dan ini juga 10. 12. Kenapa dibawa ke sini?
Jalan-jalan aja.
Mau
lihat pahlawan. Mau nyatet sejarah.
Oh. Tapi gurunya bilang ini betul apa yang dilihat sini?
Betul.
Tapi sebetulnya banyak bohong di sini. Banyak hal yang diuraikan di sini, di diorama itu tidak benar. Karena saya dulu juga kenal dengan wanita-wanita yang dikatakan begini, tapi mereka tidak berbuat begini. Jadi ini banyak sekali bohong di sini.
Gimana maksudnya bohong?
Soeharto itu berkuasa. Jadi dia membuat ceritanya sendiri apa yang terjadi di sini supaya orang benci sama PKI.
Dulu kan suka itu putar 31 September.
Iya.
Itu filmnya itu benar apa enggak itu?
Tidak benar. Iya. Banyak bohong. They say here these killings shouldn't be repeated. What happened after this was not 6 people being killed, but more than 600,000 people killed. And these are the people I'm thinking of now, because I think they deserve a monument for the way in which they were killed.
Military courts put more than 1,000 people on trial for the murder of the generals. There were no acquittals. The courts ruled that the Indonesian Communist Party was the sole puppet master behind the murders. Over 70 death sentences were handed down for the crime of having prior knowledge of the plan. But it's far from clear who else had prior knowledge of the plan to kidnap the generals. True responsibility is variously attributed to President Sukarno, General Soeharto, and Western intelligence agencies.